Welcome back. In the second part of the chapter, we want to understand how a product gets accepted into the marketplace and the stages it goes through during its life cycle. Let's start with how does it get accepted in the marketplace? What we do is we take the process and we break it down into a series of groups that are identified with consumers that fit specific definitions and descriptors. Okay? We start with the innovators. The innovators are the 2.5% of consumers who are on the far left hand side. Innovative consumers tend to be more highly educated, they tend to have more money, and they tend to be driven by the fact that they like to have the latest and the greatest, whether it's fashion, technology, or style. So they're willing to take a risk. If you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they're usually up at the self-actualization side. They don't need advice from anybody else. Okay, they use a lot of internal thinking, and they're willing to try new things to solve problems they've got. Now, they're not going to try something for which they don't see a problem. So don't think an innovator is going to buy your product because they think it's neat or because it's cool. That's not it. They buy it because, yeah, I've got that problem. I'm willing to pay extra and be one of the first people to try it out and see if this solves my problem better than others. We see innovators all the time. They're the people on your block who are the first ones that had that LED or that LCD screen. They're the ones who buy cars in the first model year. They're always the ones that have the latest and the greatest. Okay, they could live on your street. They could be relatives of yours. You've run into them. The next group you run into are what are called the early adopters. They account for about 13.5% of the market. They are similar to innovators in that they like to be at the beginning of an innovation, but they don't want to be the first ones. They never want to be the first ones, okay? They worry about what other people think about them, okay? They take those risks we talked about in the consumer behavior chapter, the cultural, the social, the personal, okay? And they think about those. So they want some sort of validation. So they look to the innovators and see what they've done. Do they like the product? Has the product been modified? Because they don't want the innovation product. They want something that's a bit more refined. Because as an early adopter, their needs are not just to have something that solves the immediate problem. They want a product that solves the immediate problem and gives them a few extra benefits, okay? Do we define either of these groups by demographics? Not really. We can say, though, that innovators tend to be higher income, higher educated, but it's really tough to pin both of these groups down to demonstrate demographics. It's usually based upon the product category more than anything else and how the behavior works in that category. If it's strictly demographic, yeah, then we can use demographics. But as you saw in the chapter on consumer behavior, it could be usage situation, it could be a behavior, it could be a variety of other sources, in which case demographics don't work in the diffusion process. We can assign them after the fact, but they're not the primary driver. Okay, so we've got the innovators, 2.5%, the early adopters, 13.5%. Then we have what are called the early majority. That's about 34%, a third of the market, okay? They're much more deliberate. They want to make sure that those first two groups are satisfied. They read a lot of reviews because they're looking at a risk. And the risk for the early majority is probably a financial risk for them, that they want to make sure they're buying something that's going to give them some degree of return and not expose them. So they typically take a lot of information into account. Now, they're heavily influenced by word of mouth. So if they have a friend who has the product and likes it, they're much more likely to buy. So this can't all be based upon promotion. This has to be based upon getting somebody who they know to talk to them and give them a benefit. Now that really fits in nicely with social media. So you find that early majority folks love social media for going on and checking forums out, okay? Next group, the late majority. That's another third, 34% of customers. They adopt a product once everybody else has got it, okay? Well, not everybody. That would be the laggards. We're going to talk about them in just a second. they make sure that like 90% of their friends have something before they run out and buy it, okay? They're not the last person on the block to get that LCD screen or LED screen, but they're probably like, they're in the bottom 10% of people that are getting that, okay? They're very much conformists, okay? Usually the only reason they purchase a product is they don't want to stand out from a crowd. So these are the people that were buying smartphones long after they become commonplace amongst a younger crowd. And that's a big thing. This group, we can say, they tend to be older and they tend to be lower income than the previous groups, okay? So the late majority, 34%, tend to be older, which is why your parents got a smartphone later on, or my father did. He didn't get one until, long after I'd had mine, right? And they tend to have a lower income. The last group are the laggards. They account for about 16% of all consumers. The laggards are very similar to the innovators, is they don't care about group norms, okay? The fact that everybody else has got a smartphone, I could care less. I love my old flip phone, okay? It does exactly what I want to do. It dials numbers, it stores numbers, and I can text on it, okay? So they don't rely on external validation for anything. They're very traditionalist, okay? I've used this thing forever. I'm going to keep using it. I'll give you a personal example. My father worked for the telephone company in Canada for 39 years, essentially. And back in those days, when he first started, before deregulation came along, the phone company would give you one free phone. It was black, and it was a rotary dial. You had to dial around. It wasn't a push button at all, okay? If you don't know what a rotary dial phone is, look it up on Google or ask your grandparents. They probably had one. Well, my father hung on to that rotary dial phone till the absolute end and refused to get anything other than a rotary dial phone because he knew the technology worked. He'd installed enough of them as an installer. And it was free, okay? So that black rotary dial phone he held on to for as long as he could. He was a traditionalist in that sense, which is funny because in some areas he's totally an innovator. But in that case, he was a traditionalist. And he didn't fit the one thing we know about laggards, which is they tend to be from the lower socioeconomic status. These are people who are generally below the poverty line. These are people who really can't afford new technology or new products. So they're very much a laggard. They'll make the best of what they've got for the longest period of time until they absolutely have to trade it in. Okay, so that's your groups. You've got the innovators. You've got the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and then last but not least, the laggards. So that's how the product moves through. So if you've got a product that's brand new, you're going after the innovators. Okay? Now, how does somebody determine how fast, or how is it determined how fast a product moves through that innovation cycle from the innovators to the laggards? It's determined by 5 characteristics. The first one's complexity. The more complex a product is, the longer it takes to run through the process. Now, if you have a look, they're constantly showing these charts about how long it took for the telephone to reach 5 million users, and then compare it to how long it took for YouTube to reach 5 million users. Well, if you think about it, the telephone was a pretty complex instrument when it first came out, okay? Talk to your parents, they might remember party lines. Usually if you lived in a rural area, or even in the city at the beginning, you didn't have a phone in your house, okay? And if you did, you were on a line that was shared by 5 of your neighbors. So when the phone rang, you had to listen for a specific ring to know it was for you and not for the people down the street, okay? I remember my grandparents had a party line. It always confused me when the phone would ring and I go to answer, oh no, that's for Bill and Sally down the road. Don't answer that one. Or even prior to that, you had to call the switchboard. Okay, so it's a pretty complicated process and pretty expensive. So the complexity of the product, the more complex the product, the longer it takes. YouTube, fairly simple to use for most people, quickly got to that 5 million user mark. The compatibility. If the technology you're bringing in is compatible with what consumers are doing, it's really easy for them to adopt it. So one of the things we've consistently talked about is changing behavior. If you have to change behavior to get people to use your product, it's going to take you a long time to go through the diffusion process. You need something that's what goes by the phrase drop in. Okay, I can just drop it in. The consumer doesn't know it's a different product. They just know they're getting the same results the same way. It's easy for them to do. So you have to come up with something which is compatible with the way people think and act. That's really what separated Apple when they were doing their products, bringing out the iPhone and the iPad and the Mac, is they took a look at how people thought and how people did things. And then they built machines that mimic that, which allowed for a speedier diffusion through the marketplace. Your relative advantage. Remember, we talked about a strategic competitive advantage back in the SWOT analysis. Well, now you've got a relative advantage. What do you do better than the competition? Usually it breaks down into one of three things. You're faster, you're cheaper, or you're higher quality. Okay? So you want to be strong on at least one and preferably two or all three of those. So if you take a look at things that have moved through the process quickly, like LCDs, well, it's the picture quality, much better than we had before, the LCD screens. The cost, once we got enough of them built, much less expensive than the old systems. And we also were able to make them easier to use. Okay? So what we've got is three things consumers want that's really aided the advantages. The next thing is observability. People like products that they can be seen with. You know, iPhones are great because they're easy to see. Okay? People know when you've got an iPhone, all right? And what they're looking at is, oh, you've got an iPhone. You must be a certain type of consumer. Or a car is another one. So it has to be observable. And last but not least, you have to have some sort of trialability to it. If somebody can try the product before they buy, see if they understand the complexity, it's compatible with what they do, they understand your relative advantage, people can see them using it, that gives them a great advantage. So trialability, the ability to try something ahead of time, is perfect. So the 5 things that separate you: complexity, compatibility, relative advantage, observability, and trialability. If you come up high on all of those, your product will diffuse through those 5 groups, from the innovators to the laggards, fairly quickly. Okay. Now, along with this, so we've got the product life cycle, or we've got the diffusion process. We overlay the diffusion process over the product life cycle. Every product has a life to it. Okay? Buggy Whips came and went. Beeman's gum came and went. Okay? Kodak film came and went. So what we need to do is figure out what stage of the product life cycle we're at. Now, there's 5 stages of the product life cycle. The first stage, introduction. In the introductory stage, you have incredibly high marketing costs because nobody knows you exist. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to convince people, A, that this is a good product, that it will serve their needs, and B, they should try it. Okay? But to do that requires a lot of money, and it's a slow process. So you find your growth rate's very slow, which is why in that curve, it's barely raises in that region. Okay. So what you're looking at is, hang on a sec. So what you're looking at is, how can you get people interested? Well, you're going after those innovators at that stage, at the introductory stage. The innovators are looking to find a product that meets a need they have, and they're willing to take a risk on it. But you still have to reach them, okay? And it's a small group. Remember, it's only 2.5% of the market, so it is going to be a slow growth. The next one you get is the growth stage. In the growth stage, that's where you start to take off. That's where you see this. And if you take a look at the old entrepreneurship, that's sort of the old hockey stick where it comes into being, okay? You get a lot of sales acceleration, and new competitors come into the market. Typically in the introductory stage, you're the only one in the market. So you can capture up to 100% of the market. Now you've got other competitors because what they've done, remember how new products work, they've taken a look at what you're doing and they've developed their own product. They've come in, okay? Profits start to go down. Profits in the introductory stage are great because you're charging a premium price to get those consumers who are innovators because they'll buy at any price. And you start to see industry consolidation. So all these little players that started off in the introductory stage, okay, they start to, at the beginning of the growth stage, they start to be consolidated down. We've seen that in the food delivery business, okay, if you want a current example. From there, and in the growth side, you're looking at the early adopters and the early majority fall into the growth side, okay, if you want to look at the diffusion. Then we get into maturity. Maturity is where the market is saturated, okay? Most products we're used to today, whether it's beer or soft drinks, they're in the maturity stage of the market, okay? There's no really new entrants. Everybody's taking market share from somebody else by tweaking their product line or by bringing out a new product in a different area to try and get some growth, okay? That's why Coke and Pepsi are both into sports drinks, water, teas, all those other areas, because the core business isn't doing anything. Okay, the core soft drink business, flat. So you look at fringe areas. Now, if you're in the maturity stage, you're trying to steal share from the other competitors, okay? Your profits are still declining, which is why you have to come up with new products in other areas or even new products in this area to try and, just prolong the maturity a little bit longer. Heavy competition. Lots of advertising going on or lots of promotions going on at this point. People are spending money just to get you to switch from one to the other. This is going to be the late majority, and your late majority group is going to be in here. Okay, that the maturity by this time almost everybody's got the product, so they want to be in on it. Okay, and the last stage is decline. In the decline stage, which there is no set length for it, it can be quick or it can be a long, steady decline. A good example of something that goes fast, a fad. Okay, so the singing bass at Christmas time, that was a fad. Its sales went like this, and then it went like this. Okay, others have a long trail off point. Twinkies. Most people would argue Twinkies are in the decline stage. The company went bankrupt, was bought out of bankruptcy because people just aren't buying Twinkies like they used to. They don't want all the chemicals that are in Twinkies. Not to mention the fat and everything else that's in them. So at this point in the decline stage, your laggards are coming in. And your laggards are only coming in because now everything's been marked down. People are trying to blow it out. Just keep it going as long as they can. Your marketing costs probably gone. At this point, your profits are so low that you try and eliminate all the non-essential marketing and other costs associated with the product, and you're just trying to wring every last dime you can out of that. There are companies that specialize in buying brands that fall into exactly this trend because they know that the brand memory lasts a long time among consumers. So as long as consumers see it on the shelf, they'll buy it even though you're not putting any other promotion into it. All right? So that takes you through the product life cycle where you go through introduction, growth, maturity, decline, and it shows you how those tie to the different diffusion points. That's it, my friends, for Chapter 11. Tomorrow we'll do Chapter 12. You all have a great day, and thanks for listening.